is Kratom dangerous? So whenever I bring up Kratom on this drug education TikTok, the comment section is just genuinely wild. So there are groups of people who are like, yeah, Kratom has never caused an overdose and it does not work on beta-arrestin, so therefore you can't overdose, so it's incredibly, incredibly safe. And this is basically the only thing that I will ever fight people on in comments, is saying something that is patently untrue to the point that it could actually endanger somebody else. So, as a drug scientist, let me break down for you what's actually going on with Kratom and its danger. Is it safe? Is it more dangerous than we think? Is it a good or bad drug? And the answer to all of that is yes. So here are some fast facts on Kratom if you're unaware what the drug is. So basically, Kratom is a drug that a lot of people take as like a tea, and they're using it in some cases to just kind of increase energy as kind of like a stimulant-like effect, but it can also be used to help people quit opioid addiction. And it seems to work decently well for that. Now, it is technically legal, but in a weird place. So you can sell it as a supplement, which means that it's not really regulated by any independent agency, but there are also no claims suggesting that it does work. So the DEA tried to actually schedule this, tried to basically allow it for only prescription purposes. And then like the world went wild. And so they backed off that. And now they're trying to basically schedule 7-hydroxymetragenine, which is just one component of Kratom. So it's legal, but unregulated, and a lot of people use it and say it's genuinely great, but what do we know about how dangerous it is? So on the comparative scale of drug danger that is just perpetually in my head, Kratom is actually relatively safe. So it's on the relatively low end of the danger scale. Now, that does not mean that it is safe. Like, what do you mean by a drug being safe? Do you mean that it's unlikely to overdose? Do you mean that it's unlikely to cause long-term effects? What do you mean by safety and danger? So there is no real safe drug or no real guaranteed dangerous drug, which is hard for people to understand because we like black and white things. Now, here are the reasons why I consider it relatively safe. First, it has pretty minimal side effects. Like, the side effects are typically things like constipation and dizziness. Also, people take it orally, which is kind of the safest route of administration for a drug. You have an immediate antidote method, throwing something back up. And the dose that actually enters your bloodstream is about half the dose that you would normally get in any other route of administration, so sometimes it's beneficial in preventing things like overdoses. And speaking of overdoses, there have been very few, and controversially few, overdoses reported from Kratom. Now, people have been using this for like centuries, but overdoses are incredibly rare. So most overdoses actually occur with a kind of combination of Kratom and other drugs. Now, there are reports of Kratom overdoses, but the problem is we don't have a good method of actually determining if somebody's overdosed from something. To know what somebody died from, you have to have a very accurate representation of what they were doing right up to that moment. Did they take headache medication that morning? Were they more likely to have a heart attack? Did they accidentally forget to take their seizure medication yesterday? Did they use any supplements? And how much alcohol have they had? And was it on an empty stomach or not? So there is a huge debate about how many people have actually died from Kratom because it's just really hard to determine if somebody's died from one specific drug. Now, these are not the usual points that people bring up when they want to talk about how safe Kratom is. The major one that they bring up is that it cannot cause respiratory depression. Now, note that that is the argument that they bring up. I am not directly stating that because I don't actually like to say things like that. Like, there are a lot of drugs that can only cause respiratory depression when linked to other drugs, but that doesn't mean that it's not associated with somebody dying from respiratory depression. How I use my words can impact whether or not somebody does something dangerous, something that could potentially kill them. Think about what you're actually saying by saying this drug does not cause an overdose. That is a dangerous thing to say. In fact, I will not even say it for things like weed, which the therapeutic index, so the dose that is potentially likely to kill you versus the dose that people typically use, is so incredibly wide. It's such a high number that it like seems hypothetical, basically. Because we have to be very careful about the language that we use around drugs. Now, I want to make sure to actually talk about what this argument is, because it's actually a really interesting and important one. So basically, the major opioids like H and Phen, they cause respiratory depression, and that's why they're so likely to cause overdoses. So basically what they do is they reduce or slow your breathing enough to the point where you basically just stop. Now, for a while, scientists thought that the thing that was causing that respiratory depression, that slowing of breathing, was actually something known as beta-arrestin. Specifically, they were like, okay, this beta-arrestin 2 pathway seems to be linked to the overdose deaths from opioids. And so then scientists were like, okay, well, we just need to create new drugs that don't interact with this pathway. That will make safer drugs. But the problem is we kind of jumped ahead of the science for this. So when other researchers tried to replicate or basically redo that original experiment, they did not find the same results. And in other experiments, they basically prevented the formation of those pathways, the ones that supposedly caused the respiratory depression, and still saw that animals had that slowing of breathing. So it wasn't necessarily just that pathway in the first place. Now let's go back to that main reason that people are saying that kratom is not dangerous, that it doesn't work on that pathway that's linked to respiratory depression, so it cannot cause someone to kind of stop breathing, and therefore you can't overdose. Now here are some problems with that argument. First, we just talked about how that's not necessarily the only thing causing respiratory depression in these types of drugs. Second, basically any science that we have on its effects on respiratory depression kind of just come from rat studies, which usually are decently translational, but when it comes specifically to this type of research, there are a lot of differences between rodents and humans. There are other ways that people could overdose on kratom that do not directly involve respiratory depression. For example, seizures. There are seizures seen in rats, and seizures have been reported in humans who've used a high dose of kratom as well. And finally, mitragynine, the thing that doesn't seem to work on beta-arrestin, is only one of the components in kratom. It is a plant, and so there are a lot of different things in the whole kratom leaves. So even if mitragynine is very safe, that doesn't mean that everything else is as well. So we need to be really careful about how we talk about these things. Is kratom safer than things like oxy and H and fen? Yeah. It's probably a really good way for people to stop using those other more dangerous substances. Should we tell people that it can't cause overdoses? No. And by saying this, I'm not being biased. I'm trying to be as unbiased as possible, which means telling you both the good and the bad, because every drug has a good or a bad. It produces a physiological or psychological effect that can be dangerous. Is caffeine safe? Relatively, yes, it is. But is it safe for my friend with heart problems? No. I get it. It's a wild world out there when you talk about drugs. There's a lot of misinformation, a lot of stigma. But we need the most unbiased, accurate information out there, which means talking about the good and the bad. And generalized black and white statements are not helping with any of that.